Lesley Molseed, 1975, Rochdale. A girl vanished, and an innocent man paid. Every town has a story it would rather forget, but some stories do not stay buried because the damage spreads far beyond the first crime. They begin with something so ordinary that no one thinks to question it until that ordinary moment becomes the last memory anyone has of a child alive. In Rochdale, England, on a quiet Sunday in October of 1975, a mother asked her daughter to walk to a nearby shop. The errand was small, the route was familiar, the day should have ended with bread on the table and a child safely back at home. But Lesley Molseed never returned, and what followed would become not only the story of her murder, but one of Britain's most devastating miscarriages of justice. Lesley lived in Turf Hill, a working-class area of Rochdale, where families lived close together and children were often seen walking between homes, shops, and nearby streets. Her family home was on Delamere Road, a place that should have been the center of her safety. To her family, Lesley was known as Lel. She was 11 years old, small for her age, and vulnerable because of serious health problems that had followed her since birth. She had been born with a heart condition and had undergone open-heart surgery as a young child. She also had learning difficulties, and those who knew her understood that she needed more protection than most children her age. But Lesley was not defined by fragility alone. She was remembered by family accounts as cheerful, affectionate, and much loved. She lived with her mother, April Molseed, her stepfather, Daniel Molseed, and siblings including Laura and Frederick. Her biological father, Fred Anderson, was also part of the wider family story. Like many homes, the Molseed household ran on small routines, and one of those routines involved the children taking turns to run simple errands. On Sunday, October 5, 1975, that routine placed Lesley directly in the path of a predator. Around lunchtime, April needed a loaf of bread and an air freshener from a nearby shop. Lesley initially pointed out that it was her brother's turn, but Frederick was out playing football, so Lesley agreed to go instead. She took money and a shopping bag, wearing clothes that later became part of the family's final memory of her, including Bay City Rollers socks connected to her sister. Nothing about the moment suggested danger. There was no argument, no obvious threat, and no reason to believe that a short walk from home could become the beginning of a case that would haunt Britain for decades. The exact details of what happened after Lesley left Delamere Road remain limited because there was no reliable witness who could fully account for her final movements. What investigators could say was that there was no confirmed evidence that she completed the errand and safely reached the shop. Somewhere between her home and that destination, Lesley disappeared. At first, the delay may have felt like something that could be explained. A child might stop to talk, take a different route, or get distracted. But Lesley's family knew her. This was not a child who would casually vanish for hours without explanation. As time passed, concern inside the Molseed home hardened into fear. The family began searching. Neighbors became involved. The streets around Turf Hill, once familiar and ordinary, suddenly turned into a map of possible danger. Every alley, road, and open space became part of the same question: where was Lesley? By mid-afternoon, police were contacted, and the search widened across Rochdale and the surrounding area. The case quickly drew public attention because a vulnerable child had disappeared in daylight during a brief errand from a community where people believed they knew what was happening around them. For 3 days, Lesley's family waited for news. Hope was still possible, but it was fading with each hour. Then, on Wednesday, October 8, 1975, a motorist made a terrible discovery on Rishworth Moor, near the road between Oldham and Ripponden in West Yorkshire. Lesley's body had been found on remote moorland, miles from home. The search for a missing child had become a murder investigation. The scene was bleak and exposed. Lesley had been left on the moor near the A672, not far from passing traffic, but far enough away to feel isolated from the world. She had been stabbed repeatedly, with wounds to her upper body and back. Forensic evidence indicated that biological material from the killer was present on her clothing. In 1975, DNA profiling did not yet exist as an investigative tool. The evidence could not name the killer, but it could still carry enormous meaning. Years later, that same evidence would destroy one conviction and secure another. The police were under intense pressure. The murder of a child creates fear unlike almost any other crime, and the local community wanted reassurance that the person responsible would be found. Investigators soon focused on Stefan Kiszko, a 23-year-old tax clerk who lived near the area. Stefan was socially isolated, vulnerable, and had never been in trouble with the police. He lived with his mother, Charlotte, and had personal traits that investigators viewed with suspicion rather than care. He was known to write down car registration numbers when drivers annoyed him, a habit that would later be treated as suspicious behavior. Then 4 teenage girls made allegations that Stefan had exposed himself to them. Those claims became a key part of the suspicion around him, but they would later be exposed as false. By then, the damage had already been done. Stefan was arrested in December of 1975 and questioned for days. During important parts of the interrogation, he had no lawyer present. He asked for his mother, but she was not allowed to sit with him. Under pressure, he confessed, then later retracted the confession. To investigators, the confession looked like the missing piece. To anyone looking more carefully, it should have raised alarms. In July of 1976, Stefan Kiszko was convicted of Lesley Molseed's murder and sentenced to life in prison. For the public, the case appeared closed. A grieving family had an answer. Police had secured a conviction. A frightened community could believe the danger had passed. But beneath the verdict sat a fact that should have changed everything. The biological evidence from Lesley's clothing contained sperm, and medical evidence showed Stefan Kiszko could not produce sperm. If that material was connected to the killer, then Stefan could not have been responsible. That truth did not save him at trial. The information was not properly presented in a way that allowed the jury to understand its full force. Stefan went to prison as a convicted child murderer while the real offender remained free. In custody, Stefan's mental and physical health deteriorated. He was attacked by other inmates and carried the weight of a crime he had not committed. Outside prison, Charlotte refused to accept the verdict. She fought for her son year after year, writing letters, contacting legal advocates, and pushing against a system that had already decided its answer. Charlotte's campaign eventually helped bring the case back into view. By the early 1990s, the evidence was reviewed again, and the conclusion could no longer be avoided. Stefan Kiszko had been wrongly convicted. In 1992, after spending 16 years in prison, his conviction was quashed. He was released, but freedom could not restore what had been taken from him. His health had been devastated, and he died in December of 1993. Charlotte died only months later. The woman who had fought to clear his name lived long enough to see the truth acknowledged, but not long enough to see Lesley's real killer held accountable. After Stefan's exoneration, Lesley's murder was once again unresolved. The original investigation had failed her, failed Stefan, and left a dangerous man untouched. But one detail from the old case had survived. During the 1975 forensic work, adhesive tape had been used to lift microscopic material from Lesley's clothing. The clothing itself was later destroyed, which was routine after the case was believed to have been solved. But the tape remained stored. That preserved tape became the bridge between the old investigation and modern science. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, forensic specialists were able to develop a DNA profile from the biological evidence. The killer had left part of himself behind on the evidence, and for decades he had no reason to believe that science would ever catch up with him. But in 2005, Ronald Castree gave a DNA sample after an unrelated police matter. When that profile was compared with the evidence preserved from Lesley's clothing, it matched. The reported odds of the match being someone else were around 1 in a billion. Ronald Castree was not an unknown drifter passing through the region. In 1975, he lived in or near the same local environment connected to Lesley's life. He had worked as a taxi driver and later became known as a comic dealer. Investigators also learned that less than a year after Lesley's murder, Castree had abducted and sexually assaulted a 9-year-old girl. She survived because she fought back and escaped. That earlier conviction became deeply significant because it showed a pattern: a young girl, a vehicle, and an isolated location. At Castree's trial in 2007, prosecutors argued that he had abducted Lesley from Rochdale, taken her to Rishworth Moor, sexually assaulted her, and murdered her in a frenzied attack. Castree denied the charge and suggested contamination or a setup, but the DNA evidence was central and powerful. The jury heard that the sample did not match Stefan Kiszko. It matched Ronald Castree. They also heard testimony connected to Castree's 1976 assault on the other young girl, a chilling parallel that helped show what kind of risk he had posed to children. There were details about Castree's life at the time that added another layer to the case. His wife, Beverly, had recently given birth, and reports from the trial described instability around their marriage. Prosecutors suggested that on the day Lesley disappeared, Castree may have been on his way to visit Beverly in hospital. That point has to be treated carefully because it was part of the prosecution narrative, not a fully witnessed account of his route. But the possibility is haunting. A man moving through an ordinary day, crossing paths with a vulnerable child who had only been sent out to buy household items. In November of 2007, Ronald Castree was convicted of Lesley Molseed's murder. He was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term of 30 years. For Lesley's family, the verdict finally answered the question that had remained open since October of 1975. Her mother, April, said the family's quest for justice was over. But the word justice sits uneasily in this case because so many lives had already been damaged beyond repair. Lesley was taken from her family when she was still a child. Stefan Kiszko lost 16 years of his life to a wrongful conviction and died before the real killer was exposed. Charlotte Kiszko gave years of her life to proving a truth the system should have seen earlier. And Ronald Castree lived freely for decades while the evidence that would eventually convict him sat preserved in storage. Today, the case of Lesley Molseed is remembered for more than one reason. It is remembered as the murder of an 11-year-old girl from Rochdale. It is remembered as a warning about vulnerable suspects, false confessions, tunnel vision, and hidden forensic truth. It is also remembered because the final answer arrived only after science advanced enough to speak for a child who could no longer speak for herself. The most painful part is how small the beginning was. A mother needed bread. A daughter left home. A family expected her back within minutes. That ordinary errand became the point where multiple lives split into before and after. Lesley Molseed was not a symbol, a legal lesson, or a name in a criminal archive to the people who loved her. She was Lel, a daughter and sister whose life ended on a lonely moor because a dangerous man found her in a place where she should have been safe.